on the slopes of Diamond Head. This is Kapiolani Community College. Kulia ika nu'u, strive for the highest.
Aloha. Welcome to BLAW200. I'm Ben Carroll. Last time we looked at how to understand the law, how to read a case, how cases and statutes interacted. Today we're going to go a little bit of a different direction. We're going to look at ethics in business and how ethics, morality, law interrelate. So again, looking at, the legal environment of business, and legal environment obviously includes these other things as well. But first of all, we're going to start out with our usual review. So let's take a look. What can we find in a well-written statute to help us understand and interpret what the law means? Okay, well, this will take us back to our beach trash example. Again, a very simple little law. It said $50 fine for leaving trash on the beach. What would have helped us with that? When we looked at it, it looks kind of clear on its face, but after we thought about it a little bit and got some specific examples that might come up in legal cases, wasn't quite so clear. Well, if we knew what the title was, it might be something like law enacted whatever. It might be called littering. So that might give us a clue as to what the purpose is. What else? Well, definitions were very important. So we didn't have definitions of what we meant by trash. We didn't have definitions of leaving. And we might have even had some concerns, what does the beach entail? So need some definitions, because even though we use common language and we would attach the ordinary meaning, that may not be enough. So that would help us. What else? Look at the legislative history. So these aren't in the text themselves, but if we're not able to determine it from the language of the law itself, then we might need to look at what the legislature said. So that's another possibility. Okay, what do we mean by the legislative history of a statute? And when we say legislative history, we're actually talking most instances about something in particular. What are we talking about? Okay, again, the legislative history actually would entail everything from the time it was first thought up and introduced as a bill all the way to where it gets enacted and it ends up in our statutes. So technically, all of that is legislative history, the history of how it became legislation, how it became a statute. But what we really want to focus on are the written explanations, and these appear most often in the committee reports. So when it's assigned, the bill is assigned to a committee, a relevant committee or two will be looking at it, and they will be deciding what should be included, whether we need to make some changes. They'll hold some hearings, get some input from interested parties, and they will discuss this. So very often we will get the purpose, we will get what the changes are, we'll get an explanation of the provisions in those committee reports. So if we do need to look behind the plain wording of a statute to see what it means, best bet really is to go to the committee reports. And increasingly those who are available online, so much easier to do than digging through the library. Okay, if we have a statute that deals with a particular activity or situation, why would we need to see what the court says about it? Okay, so again, looking back at our beach trash case. Okay, well, it certainly dealt with that particular situation, throwing trash or leaving trash on the beach. But what did the case add? Why was it important for us to know about the case that we posited had happened? Well, that case involves someone saying, I didn't leave it on purpose. Okay? It was trash, but I didn't leave it on purpose. I didn't intend to leave it. And again, when we're talking about the ring or something of value, we would say, well, we don't think they intended to leave it, so does the statute apply? And when the court read it and interpreted it, said, Leaving means leaving. It doesn't have anything to do with intent. If the legislature had wanted intent to be part of it, they would have said thrown. They could have used other wording to let us know and to make it clear that intent is important. But in the absence of that, leaving means you're gone, it's here, it's left. Okay? We can think of other instances where applying that law would become clearer when we're dealing with specific situations. So certainly with the ring, with some of the other things, the question of whether or not it's trash, the question of value would come up. So if it's not defined in the law by the legislature, then it's up to the courts to define it, which they have to do because they're applying it to this situation. We do need an answer in this case, so it's no longer theoretical. We need to determine whether this person has violated it, so we'll need to determine whether that particular thing is trash. So over time, we will develop a body of law, the common law, that tells us what this statute means. Better if it's defined up front, but if not, it will happen over time. Okay, we talked a little bit about uniform state laws. Where do they come from? Why are we interested in uniform state laws? Okay, you probably don't remember the abbreviation NCCUSL, NCUSL, but that's the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws. And this is probably the major body that comes up with proposed or model state laws that should be the same every place. In other words, uniform. So NCUSL will determine what areas it appears that uniformity among the states makes sense and will develop a law, spend quite a bit of time, several years usually, putting this together and making sure it all fits, making sure they've heard from everybody that might be interested, and then they will propose a uniform law. So at that point, they'll simply put the law out there and say, good law, we hope you guys pass it. But at the time it's first put up, it applies nowhere. It's not a national law. It's simply a proposed or model law. So they put it out there. How does it become a law in a particular state? Same way any other law does. So it has to be passed by the state legislature, and then it becomes law in that state. Now, the state can make some little changes, but generally they'll stick pretty close to the uniform law. Otherwise, it's not uniform. So they'll pass it, and we will call it the uniform law, even with some minor changes for state to state. And we did use the UCC as an example, Uniform Commercial Code, and in future sessions we'll be talking quite a bit about that because it's very important to the business side of the law. Why is it important that we have a uniform law? Well, obviously it's important enforcement-wise because it's uniform across the country. It's important to us in interpreting the law because we have all of this background information that went into making the law. We have a lot of discussions. We have a lot of proceedings that help us interpret and understand the law. And of course, if we're using the same language in different states, then it can persuade us what the law means if we haven't decided in our own state. So we could look at another state and say, here's what they think makes sense. Okay, why are we interested in appellate court cases? In other words, why do we look at the Supreme Court instead of looking at the trial court decisions? Okay, if you recall, trial court decision at the end, we end up with a judgment, piece of paper. No explanation of what went on. We don't need it because this judgment is for us in this case. We already went through the case. We know what happened. We could, of course, if we're interested in what happened in a case, we could go and look at the court records. Okay, sometimes that would have to be done in person, but you'd have to see all the papers that were filed, that sort of thing. So increasingly available online, but we would still need to kind of sift through all of this to see what it is that happened that resulted in this judgment. That's very tedious, not very useful to us. But remember, when we appeal a case, it's all in writing. So everything's done in writing. Both sides will make their arguments in writing, and we'll end up with a written opinion describing the whole case. So it will give us the facts, situation that was involved. It'll tell us what happened in the trial proceedings. It will tell us what the law is that should be applied, and then it will apply that law to those facts, and it will give us a decision, a holding, as to how that case is resolved. So now we got the whole story. And again, if we're interested in how this law would apply to our particular situation, we would look and see, is there a situation in the reported appellate cases like ours or close to ours, and then we would know how that law is applied. Because again, we would assume if our situation's very, very close, then the law would apply the same way. So we would be able to predict what's going to happen in our case. Okay, we talked about case reporting. We're interested in what a regional reporter is and where we could find our Hawaii cases. Okay, we recall that there's an official reporter, and that's the reporter that the state puts out. And in many states, including Hawaii now, we actually have a private publisher put out our official reporter. But the regional reporter is a system, West calls it the National Reporter System. It covers all the regions of the country. It's geographic. So we would have a Pacific reporter, Northeastern reporter, Southeastern, North Central, etc. So geographical, they've just divided the country up into regions, and that reporter would cover all of the appellate cases from each of those regions. And typically we would use these for jurisdictions other than our own. So we would have our Hawaii reporters or whatever state we were in, and for decisions from other places we would use the regional reporter system. So we would find Hawaii cases in the Hawaii reports, and we would also find them in Pacific because that's our region. Okay, what different parts of the would you expect to find in a court opinion? In other words, when you read the opinion, what would you think would be there, and what is the holding? Okay, when we talked about the briefing, we talked about what the appellate court decides. That's what's going to be in the court opinion. Now, there is not a set format, so different courts will write this differently. But in virtually every opinion, you would find a description of what the underlying situation is, the background, why there's a case at all. Then you would find the proceedings below, because as we talked about, if you appeal a case, you need to say what went wrong below, what procedures were improperly applied. Then you would have a statement of what the law is, what law the appellate court thinks applies to this case, and then they would actually apply that. They would analyze and apply that law to the situation and then give you the result. Okay, so the holding is really the guts of the case. It's the legal determination, kind of the bottom line where the court tells you this is what this case stands for, and in essence that would be the precedent that this case sets. So that point of law coming out of that case would be what we would rely on in the future to be predictable. Okay. Well, we're going to get on into ethics. So let's take a look at what we hope to cover. Okay, so we'll be looking at law, ethics, and morals. Now, you may or may not make distinctions between these, but we'll discuss that. There's certainly quite a bit of overlap, and there's also maybe conflict. We'll talk about how this applies in business decision-making. In other words, we use the term business ethics. We'll talk about how this may differ if we are dealing internationally. So it may differ from country to country, region to region. We'll talk briefly as examples about a couple of federal acts. We'll talk about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And then finally, we'll talk about some personal decisions and how this interacts with business types of decisions in the ethical field. Okay, so morals, ethics, and the law. Okay, are these related? Do you make some distinctions between these? Some people may think they're three separate areas. That obviously that's the angle I'm coming from. Others see an awful lot of overlap and may find that for them, ethics and morality seem very, very similar. Well, let's talk about some differences and see if it makes sense to you. Okay, so starting out with some possible differences, let's look at where these come from. In other words, we have a sense of morality or ethics or law. How do we come by that opinion? Second factor we might look at is who else shares this view? who has the same sense of these as we do. We want to look at what the penalties are. In other words, if we violate these rules, moral rules, ethical standards, or the law, what happens? And then finally, who enforces them? So I would suggest that these factors, we may see some differences between. It may help us understand these and see whether we think how similar they are and how they overlap, etc. So taking a look at morality, we're talking about some very personal core values generally. So when we think of our sense of morality, that's very often internalized. So we get it from our family, we get it from our culture, we get it from our upbringing, etc. And so we've determined that this is very central to us. Very often, if religion is strong in our lives, that's going to be a major place that we get our sense of morality. A lot of it may not be written. I mean, we may have the Ten Commandments or some other written material, but a lot of it is more of a sense that we get over time, kind of a mores. So when we think of morality, this is very basic, very core, very central, and we may use the term values. These are important values to us. Okay, now if we're moving and thinking a little bit about ethics, how is that the same or how is that different? Well, ethics generally refers to behavior, so we think of this as being what we do, how we act, as opposed to how we think. So whereas certainly in religion or morality, there may be the idea of thinking bad thoughts or having bad intentions, but when ethics, we typically think of this as being action. So we apply whatever standards we have to our behavior, and we tend to think of that as being ethical. It's very often codified, so we hear about ethics codes, ethics guidelines, ethics standards. So it's codified, in other words, written for us to follow. And another feature that we think of with ethics is it often applies to a particular group or profession. So we think of professional ethics. And most of the occupations that we consider to be a profession would have their own ethical standards, their own ethical codes that would need to be followed. Okay. Now, can something be ethical and immoral or moral and unethical? Again, depends on how closely allied these are for you, but certainly there can be distinctions between ethics and morals. Now, some of the groups that we may be part of may be voluntary groups. For example, Better Business Bureau is a group that you do not have to belong to. That's something that you would join. And when you join, you could use their logo and material if, in fact, you follow their ethical standards. So the Better Business Bureau say we believe in honesty, integrity, we have certain standards for our business. And so this is kind of like a seal of approval. If you comply with their ethical guidelines, then you are allowed to use their logo. And that may be important to you to show that we are subscribing to a certain set of ethics that we think are good ethics, and we think that you as a customer or someone dealing with us would find important. So there's any number of voluntary groups that you could join in your particular occupation or profession or dealings that have their own codes, and they will allow you to use their stamp or their logo or their whatever if you in fact comply. Obviously, if you do not follow those guidelines, then they would remove the right you have to use their material in your advertising. Now, there are other professional codes and standards that may be ethical standards, but they've been adopted in the law. For example, lawyers have a code of professional responsibility that includes things like confidentiality, how to represent your client, etc. And those have been adopted and now have the force of law. In other words, if you don't follow them, they not only will not allow you to be a bar member, but the state will then not allow you to practice. So that has the state stamp. That has now gone from just being an ethical code to now being enforced by the law. So again, we may have ethical codes that aren't also the law, and then we have some that are. So once it goes over there, then we're considering that's law. So that's got sanctions, government sanctions. That's something we have to follow. On the other hand, for example, a paralegal that works in a law office has ethical codes in voluntary associations, but they're not subject to the Code of Professional Responsibility. That's only for the attorney. So if they violate it, they may get fired, they may have other things happen, but they haven't done something illegal. Okay? Okay, and finally, we have talked a lot about the law, but just to confirm where the law fits into this pattern. The law has explicit written rules, so there's not unwritten law in the sense that we have sense of morality, right or wrong. For the law, it needs to be written down someplace for the most part. And this is particularly true, you recall, in criminal statutes. So to violate a criminal statute has to be statute, cannot be common law. The thing that distinguishes the law is who enforces it. So it's a government sanction. In other words, if it's criminal, you can be incarcerated, you can pay money, fines, or restitution to a victim. Some instances you could have capital punishment. If it's on the civil side, the government will enforce damages against you, an injunction telling you to do something or not do something. So it has the power of the government behind it. Very distinct. And we know who would enforce it. There are various enforcement mechanisms. So that would kind of separate the law from either morality or ethics, which aren't enforced by the government. Okay, so unless an ethical code or sense of morality has been incorporated in the law, the government's not going to be enforcing it. So who would enforce the ethical violation? Morality, we just talked about that. That would be the group. Okay, so might be an entire society. In other words, you might be shunned, banished, people wouldn't associate with you. You might be kicked out of an organization. They would take away your membership, your lapel pin, whatever, because you have violated their ethical precepts. They could prohibit you from saying you're a member of their group. But this is different from government sanctions. This is that particular group enforcing their sense of ethics or morality. Okay, so as we talked about, these can overlap or conflict. An action can be legal but considered immoral or unethical. And of course, you're all familiar with this. There are many instances where things are legal, but various people think that these are immoral or unethical. And a lot of these have to do, again, with very core values, with life decisions. So very hard for people to come to accommodate each other on certain areas such as abortion, euthanasia, end-of-life decisions. These are very critical to people. Many of them have a religious background to them. And these are areas where the law may say such and such is okay, but somebody's own personal sense says it isn't. So we very frequently will have areas that we think are immoral or unethical, and yet they are legal. So not at all, they're not consistent necessarily. Now, as we talked about many times, the law will incorporate, as you would expect, our general sense of what's right, our general sense of what's ethical. But we need to be real clear that the law is going to apply across the board, and we may very well have a different sense of what's ethical and what's moral that differs from what has been passed into the law. Okay, so I would like to suggest a way of decision making. There are all types of formulations for how to do this, but I hope this is useful for you. You can see I do maintain a distinction between morality, ethics, and law. If you don't like those titles, I think law pretty much by itself, but if you think that the other two questions relate more to, can be called ethics/morality, doesn't make any difference, but I hope the formulation works for you. So first question would be, is it legal? So that's kind of your bare minimum. If you violate this, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have government sanctions. So your first determination to do the very minimum is, am I doing something legal or illegal? Okay. Now, for some people, that's the only question. If it's legal, I'll do it. Okay. Again, that goes back to your own sense of morality or who you're dealing with, but that's certainly our first question and a most important question. Okay. For me, if I say the second question is it ethical? I'm saying, am I part of another group or organization that I either need to follow or want to follow what they think is proper conduct? So again, in my profession, in other groups that I'm part of, voluntary trade associations or professional groups, or just my community, is there a sense of how things are done that I want to follow or I need to follow? So that would be my second question. And then finally, how do I feel about it? For me, this is the moral question, my own internal sense. Is this something that I feel good about? And you've heard different ways of expressing this probably. Would you be okay if your decision or your action was published in the paper? Would you be okay if your parents or your children or people important to you learned about it? But this is kind of your internal, how does it feel kind of thing. So again, pretty simple formula, but hopefully that will help you make some decisions. Okay, so I want to kind of apply this in a business situation. So we're going to take a look at a cement company, and we're going to discuss a scenario that happens here, see how this works. Okay. So the scenario is that your cement company has a reputation for very high quality products and for its customer service. And you typically, after you finish a batch of cement, you'll run some quality control tests to make sure everything is up to specs the way you want it. Okay, so you've just run these tests, and they show that this particular cement batch is 10% less durable than the usual product. In other words, not up to what you usually produce for whatever reason. Okay, now the cement is still well above all the industry standards. It meets all the building code requirements and any other legal and industry requirements. So there's nothing wrong with the cement in terms of acceptability, except it's not what you usually produce. It's not as good as you usually have. Okay, now the other given we have is if you throw away the cement, this is a pretty big batch, you're going to have substantial loss. So there's going to be a real negative on the profit line if you get rid of this cement. So what kind of decisions are we going to make? Well, we want to figure out what all the options are, what are the possibilities, what can we do with this cement. We want to look at whether there are legal, ethical, or moral implications. And again, not so important whether we distinguish between ethical and moral, but we want to look and see what implications there are for any of our choices. And then finally, we want to see if we can figure out what we would do and why. Okay, so produce this cement, not up to snuff. What do we do? Okay, keeping in mind we've got a very good reputation. Don't have any information about whether we sell it at a premium, but we have a very good reputation for the quality of our product and for how we treat our customers. So what are the options we can do with this cement? Well, one of them's already in the scenario. We could throw it away. So if it's not as good as what we usually sell, we want to maintain our reputation, we'll toss it. Okay, what's the downside? Take quite a loss. What's the upside? Well, we haven't put out any cement that isn't up to our standard. So if it's not our quality, we don't sell it. Okay, certainly a possibility. Now, Your shareholders, if you're a corporation, may have some questions about why'd you take the loss. So there may be some downside there. Is there a legal problem with that? Probably not. Again, you do have a responsibility to your owners, but depends, doesn't it? So what are some other options? Let's get creative. What else could we do with this cement? What do you think? Well, we could sell it. Okay. What if we just didn't say anything? Close enough, right? I mean, it meets the industry standards. It's not dangerous. It's not going to fail when it should hold. So, can we sell it? Any problems with that? Well, are we misrepresenting it? We're not saying anything. Is that a problem? Have to think about that. But what if we sold it and said our usual high-quality cement? Well, then we're just lying, aren't we? We're misrepresenting it because it's not our usual high quality. So that would be a problem. What if we sell it and we tell the people, okay, this batch isn't quite as good, still meets the standards, but we'll sell it. We've disclosed. Any issues there? Well, if we're being honest with them, they get the choice. Okay. So that disclosure may be important. What else could we do? What do you think? Well, we could use it in our own plant. Perhaps we needed to do the parking lot, whatever. Again, no problem with that. And finally, hopefully you're thinking there may be a way to salvage the whole situation. So what would be an option that might actually turn into a plus? Okay. Well, your accounting or income tax folks have probably figured out, well, what if we donated it to a charitable institution and took a tax write-off? Okay, so there we may get even a plus. Okay, so the tax benefit from donating this to a charitable organization might take away a lot of the sting of not being able to use that. So is there a right ethical decision here or a right moral decision? Well, you're going to be weighing all these factors and you will decide what makes sense for your company. Okay, but you do want to keep in mind reputation, which is quite important, and you do want to avoid anything illegal. In other words, representing this cement is something it isn't. So we do have kind of that legal floor, but the rest of it is not quite so clear. So that's where we would use our own decision-making capabilities. Okay, we could expand. I gave you kind of a simple 3-point, and I've highlighted the ones that were part of the 3 points, but a number of other people would suggest that we look at this even broader. So start out by what is the problem or goal? Okay, again, that was implicit, that was clear when we had this cement. Who are the stakeholders? And this is a very important question, and we will get more into this when we talk about corporations. Okay, by stakeholder, it's just another word for interested party. So we're asking, who's interested in the results here? And I did suggest that if we're a corporation, we have to satisfy the owners, because the managers aren't necessarily the owners. The people deciding to toss the cement aren't necessarily the people who will be stuck with the lack of profit. Okay. Now we may look at all different kinds of interested parties. Again, we'll be revisiting this, but there can be customers, suppliers, the environment, the public in general, a variety of people that may be affected by our decisions. Okay, then the ones that we had already looked at in our short version, what are the options, what are the consequences? We want to look whether there's a right or wrong choice. Okay, certainly in the law, if it's a legal issue, there's a right and wrong choice. Right following the law, wrong breaking the law. There may be a sense of that even in our ethical or moral choices as well. There may be a sense that this is just wrong. Okay? Is there an ethical dilemma? Now, what do we mean by a dilemma? We mean where we've got two ways to go. And we talk about this as being a right choice. In other words, if we have differing interests, differing stakeholders, it may be that a decision is good for some of the interested people, bad for others. So it's not as easy as a right-wrong decision. It's which competing interest is more important. So are we more concerned with our reputation? Are we more concerned with not suffering a loss? Are we more concerned with the employees here, or are we more concerned with the owners here? So you need to rank and figure out how those fit for you. But the right dilemma is obviously harder to deal with than the right-wrong for most people. Okay, again, part of our short one was what would you decide and why? And just suggest here that there are many different formulations. Virtually any book you pick up will tell you what a process to go through decisions, and most of them will look like either the shorter or longer version. And main thing for you is to find something that works for your company and or you personally. Again, want to keep out of trouble, but also want to personally feel okay with your decisions. Okay, so revisiting the short version, wording it a little bit differently so that it doesn't, so if you're still not comfortable separating ethics and morality, then here's another formulation. Does it violate the law? Okay. Does it violate some other standard that you need or want to follow? And finally, does it violate your own sense of right and wrong? And if you can come through this and say that you feel comfortable with it, you're in good shape. Okay, now we talked about particularly our sense of morality and ethics differ from different groups, but also our laws do. We know that laws can differ between states, and certainly they can differ between countries. So if we are operating in more than one place, then not only will we be looking at perhaps distinctions between what our ethical sense is and what the law is, but we'll be looking at distinctions between how those play out in one location versus how they're viewed in another place. So all of these are different, can be different in different places. Our ethical sense, what we consider to be right or wrong or moral, and certainly the laws can change across the world. Now, in some matters, there's going to be some international conventions. So just as we've decided what is legal between the states, in other words, we have conventions where we have similar laws between the states, we have the same thing internationally, and we do those by treaties or what we call conventions. So there may be agreed ways of dealing with other people that have been incorporated, and we would have recourse similar to legal recourse if those are violated. So we'll talk a little bit more about international organizations and some of that later, but there are some agreements as to what is considered proper behavior between countries and international individuals and companies. But as you can see from this, you could very easily be subject to several sets of rules if you are an American company operating overseas. So you may be subject to American laws that cover you even when you're dealing outside the country, as well as the laws of the place where you're operating. So you may have completely different goals to keep out of trouble both places. Okay, so what kind of things would we dealing with if we're talking about international ethics? Well, we can talk about various kinds of transactions, and again, a lot of these are in the area where we have treaties or conventions. So when we're talking about pirating the goods from another place, in other words, violating trademark or copyright, that sort of thing, then we have some conventions about that, agreements between the countries. Other transactions may be dumping, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about government regulation, but dumping is where a country will sell its goods cheaper than cost or in order to, in a sense, invade another market. So we'll talk about tariffs and trade barriers, etc., but this is obviously an area where there is some interaction internationally, and there may be differing standards. There are different laws in different countries, such as child labor. So there are some issues if we are having our product manufactured in a country by children or underpaid people or some other group that in the U.S. would be protected, but is not in that country. So there's certainly some issues that may arise there. Something called fair trade, and you see this nowadays, you see it often with respect to coffee or other products that come from countries where there's a concern whether or not the person actually farming or creating the product is being adequately compensated vis-a-vis the middlemen or suppliers, etc. There's certainly some issues that come up about globalization, operating in different countries, outsourcing, in other words, rather than using labor in our country, which costs a certain amount, going to another place, similar to the child labor brought up. And then finally, there's issues about whether or not it's ethical to deal with countries that are involved with terrorism or civil, human rights violations in their country, that sort of thing. So occasionally we have boycotts of trade with other countries. For many years, South Africa, when it had apartheid, people would not trade. And so there's issues about that that could certainly be considered international ethics. Okay, to get right down to a more basic practical application, there are different ideas about what constitutes bribery in different countries. So, for example, in a fair amount of Latin America, Middle East, other countries have a different sense about what we pay for and what's appropriate to pay for. There are a lot of theories about this. Certain countries have very low-paid government workers, etc. So you pay a little money to make things happen. So in, I think, the Middle East, we have the term bakshish, which means money to make things happen. Mexico and parts of South America, you have something called mordida, which means the little bite, so it's a little extra to make sure things happen. But the real different sense about what bribery is, so we use the term bribery in the U.S., it may be a different, certainly a different feel for what's in the other countries. Okay. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and this does refer to bribery, so that's why I used it as an example. It prohibits payment to foreign officials for providing a business opportunity. Okay, so if we pay them directly and what we're paying them for is for them to give business to our company, that would be barred by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. On the other hand, it does not prevent payment to minor officials for ministerial acts. In other words, something that they need to do anyway. So it's not giving business, but it's processing our application or something. They have to do it anyway, and if we give them a little money to make it happen faster, grease the wheels or grease the skids, so to speak, then that's not considered a violation of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So what is that distinction about? Well, again, it's paying government officials to have business provided to us, which violates the act. If you think about it, paying to make something happen a little faster, is that a bribe? Well, that might not even be a bribe in the United States. For example, if you go to a copy shop or if you and you need something, a rush order, you might expect to pay more. In other words, if you can wait a week, one price. If you need it right now, photos in the hour, whatever, you will pay more. So you're paying to make it happen faster. And even in some state agencies, you can pay a little extra for something expedited. So again, if you need your business documents filed in a week, 2 weeks, no problem, regular rate. If you need them right now, you've waited, got some deadlines, there are often payments for expediting that, making it happen faster. Is that a bribe? Well, we don't even consider that a bribe here. So that's a distinction here, but there's even broader categories overseas of what's considered proper, but kind of related. In other words, pay to make it happen. Okay. Okay, another act I wanted to briefly talk about, and we will talk about this more when we talk about corporations, is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And this happened in reaction in the early 2000s to a bunch of scandals and fraud, Enron, Tyco, WorldCom. And what the Sarbanes-Oxley Act did is put some requirements on publicly held companies, in other words, companies that are traded to the general public, subject to the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, put some requirements on them and on auditors. So it made them more accountable because of some of the things that had happened. It also, two of the major provisions, quite a number of provisions, but two of the major provisions made the corporate officers responsible for financial information, because previously they'd been able to say, I'm not the financial person. We relied on the auditors, the accounting firm. That's their problem. I know nothing. It takes that away, so it makes them personally accountable. And it also has some whistleblowing provisions. Okay, so it has some provisions where if somebody reports things that are going wrong in their company, they're protected. So talk just briefly about what whistleblowing is. Okay, there you see the whistle. Well, what is whistleblowing? Where did that term come from? Actually, this term comes from England. Whistleblowing refers to the English bobby, in other words, the English policeman. And for many years, the British policemen did not carry weapons. They carried a whistle. So when they would see something going wrong, see a criminal or malefactor, they would blow their whistle and call other bobbies, other policemen in to help. So what's a whistleblower? It's somebody that blows the whistle, somebody that points out a wrongdoer. Okay, so more and more there are protections that will allow somebody that reports their company doing something wrong, reports somebody doing a criminal act, and they are protected. So they can do that anonymously. Now you can do it on the internet. It's like Crime Stoppers. In other words, you can anonymously report something happening. And the intent is that you will be protected because the public wants to know when people are doing something wrong. Okay. Just want to talk briefly about the instances where you may find that your own personal sense is different from the company you're working for or another group that you are working with, and how this can come up and what you can do about it. So there may be instances where your company will ask you to do something and it's not illegal, but it's something that violates your ethical or moral sense. So what could some of these examples be? Well, a while back there were some pharmacists, and the pharmacy sold contraceptives, and some of the pharmacists said, I don't believe in contraception, so I don't want to sell that. Okay, there are other instances where you could be asked to do things that you just don't feel right about. Okay, are you protected? Can you refuse? Can you be fired? How does that work? Well, we'll be looking a little more at this when we talk about employee rights, certainly, as to how you're protected. But this is kind of a broader sense of where these ethical and moral collisions can happen. Again, if it's illegal, if you're asked to do something illegal, you're protected to the extent the law can protect you. But if it's not illegal, then some other questions arise. Okay, so just kind of sum up business ethics. We have to look at the responsibilities to different stakeholders. Okay, so there's a variety of people that may be affected by our decisions. Some of them are obvious, some not so much. And again, when we talk about corporate responsibility, we'll talk about the various groups that could be involved. We may have responsibility to something as vague as the environment. You know, do we need to recycle, etc.? Is that an ethical question or a moral question? To animal rights. In other words, you see Many of the cosmetics say no animal testing. Do we have responsibilities to non-humans? Do we have responsibilities to society in general? But again, we'll consider who the stakeholders are, who the interested people are that are going to be affected by our decisions. Okay. We're going to talk more about corporate structure. As many of you know, the thing about a corporation is that the owners are separated from the managers, so you have control separated from ownership, and so we would have responsibility to owners as well as employees, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some things that happen there that we'll look at, and we'll talk more about corporate responsibility when we get there. There's considered to be corporate social responsibility, and then, again, this is what we kind of hinted at with respect to the environment. In other words, does the corporation have responsibility to not just the people it directly interacts with, suppliers, customers, employers, etc., but does it have responsibility to kind of the broader society, the environment, etc.? So is there a social responsibility over and above what the responsibility to individuals that are directly connected to it? And there's a lot of different opinions about this. Some of you may be familiar with Milton Friedman, whose position is, if it's legal, it's ethical. No distinction. If we can do it legally, that's all we got to do. So from his point of view, our responsibility is to make money as a corporation, to pay our shareholders. That's what we're designed to do for profit. And as long as we're legal, we've met our requirements. Okay? So certainly one position kind of cuts out your own sense of morality, ethics, or puts them all together. That's one position. We hear about green companies now where people want to do business with people they think are being responsible or having a higher ethical view of corporate responsibility. Okay. Again, we talked about protection of employees. Certainly, you are protected from committing illegal acts. You may be protected if your actions are governed by your religious views. So there may be some protection of religion. We'll look at those when we get there. And we'll look at government regulation. And this would happen in the sense of anti-monopoly, in other words, making sure competition exists, that sort of thing. So we'll be revisiting ethics fairly frequently in different contexts. So this was just kind of our initial go. Again, ethics, very broad topic. Business ethics, what are we talking about? We're talking about ethics applied in a business situation, very similar to business law. In other words, not a set, completely defined area, but just a practical applied ethics. And I just wanted to end up by looking at all the possibilities when we talk about ethics. So, of course, we have business ethics, we just talked about, so applying it to business. Okay, we got the Dalai Lama, Ethics for the New Millennium, just in time. We certainly have Christian ethics, so a certain take on that. Ethics in the multicultural context. Okay, so different cultures, different countries, different areas, different thoughts about that. We have different professions, biomedical ethics. So creation of life, genomes, genetically modified things, a lot of issues there. We've had that in taro cultivation in Hawaii. Chinese etiquette and ethics in business. Okay, so is etiquette part of ethics? Yeah, okay. Paralegal ethics. Teach yourself ethics. And finally, directly relevant to us, how companies lie. So, a final thought on what's ethical or not in business. We have negotiation. Is it okay to tell little white lies. Is there a difference between white lies and other color lies when we're negotiating? Do we have to tell everybody, completely be transparent and reveal things? Or is lying expected? Is it like bluffing in poker? It's part of the game. It's part of the rules. So, again, we'll be looking at this. A lot of this is going to be very personal, but we will be revisiting this at appropriate times. Just wanted to get you starting to think about ethics. Okay, then. Well, I hope you will take a look at the readings on Laulima. There's a lot more there. We covered a whole lot of material on ethics, and there's just an awful lot available. It will hopefully make it a little clearer where it's going to come up in the future. So, this is Ben Carroll. Have a happy, ethical, and moral time until we meet again. Aloha.